So I've recently been playing Wild Hearts. Thanks to the fine folks over at Koei Tecmo and EA, we here on the channel have had access to a very early access version of the game, which contains a decent amount of the content going around to at least actually get a proper feel for the game. What we had is essentially the first map, the first 3 of the Kimono, which is the name for the nature-infused beast that you'll be hunting, and also a few of the weapons that will be available at launch. And as someone who plays, well, a probably unhealthy amount of Monster Hunter, I figured this was probably a good discussion to have with you all, as for obvious reasons, this game probably has your attention at least a little bit if you're already a Monster Hunter fan. There are very few games in this specific genre, the hunting-focused action RPG, and whenever a new one comes around, it is hard to not take interest in it. So today I'm going to be talking about how I feel Wild Hearts compares to a Monster Hunter game with the number of hours that I've gotten my own hands on it, which is probably around 20 hours myself, to control it myself, walk around the world, build the Karakuri, and fight the creatures that we have around. First up, there are 2 things very important to note as we start this. 1, this is an incredibly early build. There will be bugs, it isn't fully optimized yet by any means, so this may not be perfectly representative of the full game upon release. Secondly, and very importantly for the context of this video, the section of the game that we got to play is the very beginning. These are the first 3 Kimono that you will fight within the game, and we had the most basic of gear with which to fight them as well. This isn't indicative of later game mechanics or monsters really at all, just a taste of what it has to offer. Its general gameplay loop and the feel of the combat itself. With that in mind, it would be wise to compare what I talk about today to the early game in a Monster Hunter title rather than something like Elder Dragons. I mean, if King Tusk doesn't quite feel like an Gigante level threat, there is a very good reason for that. That said, let's talk about some of the more interesting comparisons and differences here to note. A question that is probably on everyone's minds here to start off with then, will this be a competitor to Monster Hunter? Well, in the most literal sense, yes, it is a similar style of game, but also quite importantly, the gameplay, which is the main thing about a game like this, and at least what I've done so far, it feels really good. It is a satisfying game to play, and that is a really big deal for a game like this.
I like it.
Let's start then with the Kimono, the monsters that you fight. As far as comparing these to early game Monster Hunter, they're quite a bit more complex. The first one that you get to fight properly is called Ragetail, a big old rodent with a fruit for a tail, and if you tried to compare this to Great Jagress, for example, this one definitely has quite a bit more going for it. In Monster Hunter comparisons, directly speaking, this thing has a tiny little bit of Duramboros in it, using its tail for momentum to swing itself around, a little bit of Bishaten in it, sometimes just sitting on its tail before launching into an attack, and something quite cool is that you can actually fully sever this tail as well, removing its fruit from the equation just entirely. I would say there is definitely a notable difference here between Monster Hunter design philosophy and Wild Hearts design philosophy, but I still think that Wild Hearts Kimono are quite good as we've seen so far. They make me excited to see more and find out exactly what else they've come up with, so generally, I just consider this a really good sign. As far as we know, every one of them is essentially based on real animals but overtaken by nature, and I have to wonder if that will be something solved through the story of the game, bringing us to an understanding of what has caused this, or if it's just the way that the world has always been. We don't really know yet. Another big point of note here is the world and the maps themselves. The way that base building works within this game is quite interesting. In Monster Hunter, there are set camps and set locations. You can find them out in the wild, then you unlock them and you can fast travel to them afterwards. From these camps, you can eat food, restock items, change your equipment up, all of that stuff. In Wild Hearts, the camps work from a system known as Dragon Load. When walking around the map, you will find different areas with glowing red vines coming out of the ground. If you interact with them, you will unlock more resources and more locations that you can build the more permanent structures. From here, you have the option to build lots of different little things. You can make a tent which allows you to fast travel, a workbench that allows you to change your gear, make new gear, and upgrade the gear as well. You can build a radar station that will tell you the location of all nearby Kimono, and you can even build these further out in the field so that you can spread out your radar network. Any and all of these things can be done, and what's unique about this is that there is a limit to how many of these structures you can make, but not to what can be done in each location. By this, what I mean is while you can only set up a couple of different tents on the map, at least in this early section of the game, you are completely in charge of where you want these tents to be, and therefore you're in charge of your fast travel locations. A major part of this is that we unlock early in the game section as well is a sort of zipline tool that you can set up literally wherever you want. The only thing that gets in the way of it is that monsters can destroy it with attacks if you put it in zones that they fight in. But aside from that, you just put it down somewhere, aim it where you want to go, fire it, and then you have a two-way zipline to go back and forth from places that would otherwise be quite a trek to get to. I really like this mechanic, and this is obviously just dipping our toes in the water when it comes to the Dragon Karakuri.
The world is
On the note of the maps themselves then, I found this first map we are given quite similar to Monster Hunter World for a sort of direct comparison. It's massive, sprawling, tons of environmental shenanigans going on, there's a lot of verticality in different areas, it's a sort of dedicated nest type area for each creature as well, but more interesting, there were fallen over structures, and even buildings that you could fight inside of, which actually do interact with the weapons too. Most notably, the hunting bow has an arching shot that fires into the air and then lands on the creature, but if there's a roof above you, this obviously stops that attack from interacting normally. Obviously this does cripple your damage a little bit, but I do also enjoy the immersion of having to fight differently in different areas and be properly aware of your surroundings. There is also a cooking system within this game to give you various buffs before a hunt, but we've been told that it is incredibly subject to change, so it isn't really worth going in depth on at the moment, aside from saying that the mechanic does exist. But one thing that is very comparable to Monster Hunter is the ability to fight with a little buddy, which in Wild Hearts are the Tsukumo. These little robot buddies can be found around the map in various locations, and as you find them, you will collect gears. These gears can be used to upgrade the Tsukumo's various functions, and once you have found even one, they will start to hunt alongside you. Throwing tiny crates from a distance or pulling up Karakuri threads from the ground for you to use, they have various little uses that are quite interesting, and on occasion, the Kimono actually seem to target them instead of the player too, so they do help make the hunts just that slight bit easier as well. Next up then, let's talk about how the weapons compare to Monster Hunter. At a glance, at least without knowing if they can change at all throughout the game and in later stages, they seem a little bit shallower than Monster Hunter's weapons. This isn't to say that they're bad by any means, but that each weapon seems to have a bit fewer options in its attack style. However, that said, this is also heavily offset by the Karakuri interactions. Things like jump attacks off of a box or spring attacks off to the spring, even the ability to light weapons on fire with a special move, and all of these weapons have unique interactions with all of these mechanics. This seems really cool, and there's obviously a ton of room for expansion on the mechanic for further you get in the game, and these will heavily change the way that the combat feels as a whole in unique ways for each and every weapon available. As well, I will say that every weapon that I got to play feels genuinely good. They are all satisfying to hunt with, and at the end of the day, that is the main thing that you want from this kind of game. The Kimono feel good to hunt against, and the weapons feel good to use to fight them. Everything else is just sort of window dressing at that point, honestly, so I'm just excited to see how it all expands as the game continues past the short bit of it that we got to play around in. There is also an interesting mechanic called Hunter's Arm, where you can jump on and actually grab the monsters like you are climbing around in Breath of the Wild or Shadow of the Colossus, just pulling yourself across its body, and if there is a glowing blue part, you can pull out a bunch of extra Karakuri thread, which exceeds your maximum amount that you can hold by a surprising amount as well. At one point when fighting the King Tusk, I think I actually had around 40 thread that I could use, and in theory, this just means a few really cool things. Firstly, it means that there could be some Karakuri that just cost an insane amount of thread to use properly, but also it means that you can create a load of Karakuri in a short period of time around this mechanic. You can combo them in interesting ways, like putting a spring down towards a box, but way more deep and extreme than that, obviously. This game has a ton of potential interactions in combat that could totally shake up the feel of every single hunt. Overall, I think the Monster Hunter weapons have more going for them, but these are no slouches by any means. They're incredibly fun and solid weapons, and I'm interested to see if they change it all further throughout the game. As well, I did want to compare the multiplayer experience a little bit, because I find it quite interesting in Wild Hearts so far. First up, the cap on a hunt is 3 people rather than the 4 people in Monster Hunter. This does make things a little bit less chaotic, but it still has a similar feeling to Monster Hunter, where hunting with a full group just makes the hunts much easier for obvious reasons. The creatures flinch easier, and obviously with more targets you have less dodging to do, and so hitting your attacks is easier as well. But the unique thing about it in this game is the Karakuri. The Karakuri are essentially just parts of the environment that you create yourself as a player, and so they interestingly of course exist for every player once created. 3 players means 3 times as much building potential, so if someone else builds a box, you can jump on it. If someone else builds a spring, you can launch from it. It's just an interesting aspect of cooperation that changes the playing field in an interesting way.
Teamwork.
A couple of final major notes then for this comparison. I do want to talk about status effects in this game. There were 2 of them that we've gotten so far. The first one is just a general sort of stun mechanic, where if a monster hits you enough, you have to jiggle your stick around and mash your buttons to be able to move again, and this is very similar to the same exact thing in Monster Hunter. But then there was also a sap mechanic with Sapscourge, where if you got hit by a sap, you wouldn't be able to move properly or really do anything until you use the spring Karakuri. And I thought this was actually quite neat in its own way. The ability to tie certain Kimono to certain Karakuri Karakuri, so that these Karakuri are just stronger in different fights, requiring you to react in different ways and prepare for different monsters in special ways. Another example of this that isn't necessarily a status is in the King Tusk fight. He will charge relatively frequently. This charge is vicious if it hits you, it just does a ton of damage, and it has lots of tracking, so it is incredibly hard to straight up avoid with dodging or sliding. But if you put up a wall of the Karakuri boxes, which is making 2 lines of 3, it will transform into a barricade and actually knock him over if he charges into it. This mechanic did feel a little bit boss fighty, but it is the literal third fight in the game, and it is trying to teach you a mechanic, so I don't mind it at all with that context considered. Really, the only major complaint that I had with Wild Hearts in my time so far with it was the camera itself. It wasn't game breaking by any means, but specifically when interacting with the larger Kimono, it just sort of got pretty aggravating. When fighting King Tusk with the umbrella, all I could think was, I wish I could zoom the camera out. I was staring at the inside of his body, I was staring at the side of his leg, while trying my best to predict the attacks that I couldn't really see on my screen and also land my own hits. If I had any advice for the developers, it would be to specifically bring the camera a fair bit further out when fighting the Kimono of this size. Not necessarily for everything in general, as this would affect the other fights, but specifically when you are fighting the giant creatures, you need to be able to see a larger amount of the area around you, or else it just feels all funky like this, and I think this definitely needs to be adjusted before the game is released. And then the last thing that I really want to talk about then is the healing mechanic. It is very simple. You have a maximum of 10 at a time, it heals about half of your health bar when you use it, and you can refill this either at set locations entirely around the map, or just by finding healing water plants which give you 2 at a time. In this early game setting, I never really found myself lacking this liquid, as you could just always gather a load of it in every single zone you were fighting in, but I do expect this to become more of an impactful limit further on in the game for sure. This is probably just a factor of it being very early days. Overall then, as far as comparing this with Monster Hunter, I was extremely impressed. Going into this experience, I expected Wild Hearts to be an interesting and cool change of pace, but what I didn't expect was for it to create this genuine urge within me to keep playing. That sort of addictive feeling that you just want to do one more hunt, you just want to keep going just that little bit longer. In fact, I absolutely wish that I could play more right now, as we only had access to it for a 3-day period, and I actually find myself missing it quite a bit now that I can't play it anymore. For a whole new IP, a whole new excursion into the creature hunting genre, I think this game absolutely has legs. 4 per creature at the moment, and 2 for each person. Jokes aside, I really do think this game will be a fun experience, and I find myself quite excited to see what the rest of it has in store, given that this was the very beginning. As at the end of the day, it is the longevity of the game that I'm most curious about. These are the first 3 Kimono that you can fight, but the first 3 of how many? If it's the first 3 out of say 15, then that is a lot different than if it were the first 3 out of 30, you know what I mean? It's a very different percentage and a very different context to which to understand them. So while I'm definitely looking at this from the perspective that these are the beginner creatures in a beginner area, it is all relative to what the full game will actually be, and only time can give us those answers. And that's just about it, everyone. If you have any questions about our time with the game so far, then feel free to ask them in the comments, and we'll try to get back to you on anything that we're allowed to answer. But I think this is a pretty good comparison of a lot of the questions I had myself between this game and the Monster Hunter series. Like if you like the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.